Alright, this is assignment 10.5. This is sine and cosine. So we're getting closer to having all three, sine, cosine, and tangent. The first one, it says use this diagram to match these ratios to these trig functions, basically. So if this is cosine of A, remember, so ka toa is going to help you out. So cosine of A, cosine was adjacent over hypotenuse. So once we're at A, our adjacent would be this one, and the hypotenuse would be that one. So we're looking for B over C for cosine of A. So B over C, that's choice B. Second one says sine of A, so we look at sine. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse. Again, we're looking from A, so here's A. Opposite would be this lowercase a, hypotenuse would be the C. So that's going to be C. And then the third one, the tangent of A, coming back over here to SOHCAHTOA. Tangent is opposite over adjacent. So from A again, our opposite is A, and our adjacent would be B. So A over B has to be option A. Next part, it says find sine of A, right? Your answer is a decimal rounded to 4 decimal places. So remember for sine, I'm just going to put that one over here. It's opposite over hypotenuse. So we're looking from A. So coming from this angle up here, our opposite would be the 12. And our hypotenuse would be the 15. So it would be 12 over 15. Since it says decimal, we're just going to throw it in the calculator. 12 divided by 15. And it gives us 0.8. Next one, again, we're looking from angle A, so we're right here. Our opposite would be the 16. Hypotenuse would be this 34. So you're going to go 16 over 34. Calculator. For 4 decimal places, it'd be 0.4706. And then number 6, from angle A, which is down here, our opposite would be 24. The hypotenuse would be the 26. So you're going to go 24 divided by 26. Calculator says the answer is 0.92308. Ooh, I did 5 spaces. So it'd be 0.923 and then 1. That'd be 4 spaces. There we go. Number 7 says find the cosine of A. So we're looking from A still, but for cosine, it was adjacent over hypotenuse. So adjacent is going to be this 9. And the hypotenuse is going to be the 15. So it'd be 9 divided by 15. We get 0.6. Next one, we're still going from A. We're still using cosine. So our adjacent side would be this 30. And then the hypotenuse would be the 34. 30 divided by 34. We get 0.8824. And then number 9, from angle A over here, adjacent would be 10. Hypotenuse would be this 26. So 10 divided by 26. We get 0.3846. Next section says use a calculator to approximate the value to 4 decimal places. So let's just put in the calculator, round correctly. So the sine of 48, 0.7431. Cosine of 80, 0.1736. And then the cosine of 10, 0.9848. So pay attention to the directions. When it says 4 decimal places, you have to go 4 decimal places. Number 16, it says find the sine and the cosine of A. And it says write your answer as decimals rounded to 4 decimal places if necessary. So if I'm going from this angle, angle A, when it comes to the sine, I'm going to go opposite over hypotenuse. So for the sine of A, it's 6 over 10. And then I put that in my calculator and it gives me 0.6. Then I do cosine of A, which is adjacent over hypotenuse, and it'd be 8 over 10. In the calculator, that gives me 0.8. So then these would be my two answers, here and here. Next one. So if I'm going for the sine of A, opposite is 8, hypotenuse is 17. I have to put that in the calculator. I get 0.4706. There's one of my answers. And then for the cosine of A, it'd be adjacent over hypotenuse, 15 over 17. I get 0.8824. Number 18. Here's my angle A. For the sine of A, it's going to be opposite over hypotenuse. If I put that in the calculator, it's going to give me 0.5. Cosine of A is going to be adjacent over hypotenuse, so it's 4 square root of 3 over 8. So 4 square root of 3 divided by 8. I get 0.8660. And it is important that I do put the 0 to show that it's 4 decimal places. Number 19, it says use sine ratio to write an equation to find x. So if I have this angle down here where the 66 is at, x is going to be opposite and 16 is going to be hypotenuse. So I'm going to say the sine of the angle is the opposite over the hypotenuse. And then number 20 says to solve this equation. So remember, it doesn't matter if it's sine, cosine, or tangent. You're always going to put the number from the fraction first. You're always going to put the sine, cosine, or tangent at the end with its angle. And then in between, this is where you're going to choose multiply or divide. X is on top. You're going to multiply. So in this case, I'm going to put multiply right there. It's going to be 16 times the sine of 66. And I get 14.6. And we're talking feet. Side B, it says use the triangle at the right. Find the trig ratio. So if I'm looking at sine, remember I'm going to want to write SOHCAHTOA again. I always want to have it on the page. So sine is opposite hypotenuse, cosine adjacent hypotenuse, tangent opposite over adjacent. So sine, I'm looking for opposite over hypotenuse. So if I'm looking from P, my opposite is 5, hypotenuse is 13. If I'm doing the cosine of P, I'm going to go, okay, here's P again. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. So it's going to be 12 over 13. Then I have tangent of P, so I'm still at this angle. Tangent is opposite over adjacent, so it's 5 over 12. On these problems, we're looking from angle R. So R is up here on the top right. So if it says sine of R, my opposite is 12, hypotenuse is 13. Cosine of R is going to be adjacent over hypotenuse, so it's 5 over 13. And then the tangent of R is going to be opposite over adjacent, so it's going to be 12 over 5. Now it says write your answer in simplest form, so we want to do fractions. If we're doing sine and cosine of A, the sine of A is going to be opposite over hypotenuse, 15 over 25. If I reduce that, it's 3/5. And when I do the cosine of A, I'm still at angle A, but now I'm doing adjacent over hypotenuse. So it's 20 over 25. That's 4 over 5. That's an ugly 5, but it's a 5. Number 8, for my sine of A, it's going to be opposite over hypotenuse. That's 5 over 10, which is 1/2. And for my cosine of A, adjacent over hypotenuse. So here's A, adjacent's 5 square root of 3. And then hypotenuse is 10. If I simplify that, all I'm going to do is 5 and 10 reduces to 1 over 2. So 1 times the square root of 3 is the square root of 3 for the numerator. And then 10 divided by 5 was 2. That's your denominator. That's simplified. Number 9, for my sine of A, I go opposite over hypotenuse, 80 over 100, and that ends up being 8 over 10, which is 4 over 5. And then I do the cosine from that same angle, so now I'm going to do adjacent over hypotenuse, 60 over 100, and I put that on my calculator, and I'm going to get 3 over 5 if I reduced it. So these would be my two answers. Over here it says use the calculator again, because you really need to get the practice in of rounding to 4 decimal places. So cosine of 53.6018. Sine of 61 per sine per 61, 0.8746. And then sine of 13, 0.2249 is going to go up, so it's actually going to be 2250. That's one of the trickier ones when it comes to rounding. Number 16 says find the length of the legs of the triangle, round your answers to the nearest tenth. So this is what we're preparing for. Because it doesn't tell you to use sine or cosine or tangent, you have to choose it. So remember, we have SOHCAHTOA up on the top of the page. If I'm trying to find x, I'm going to pretend y isn't even there, and I'm going to go from that angle. This is my opposite, and this is my hypotenuse. And then I'm going to choose between sine, cosine, and tangent. So if I have opposite and hypotenuse, there's my opposite and hypotenuse, I'm going to use sine. So now I start off with, I know I'm going to use sine. Remember that the angle goes next to the trig function, and on the other side of the equal sign, you're going to have a fraction. Your opposite is going to go to the top, and your hypotenuse is going to go to the bottom. This is going to be rewritten as 10 times, because it's on the denominator, and because the variable's in the numerator, and then sine 28. That's what you put in your calculator. So it's going to be 10 times sine 28. You get 4.7. So x is 4.7. In that same drawing, we're also looking for y, so we're going to pretend x isn't there. Now we're looking at y, and we go y is adjacent. 10 is still the hypotenuse. So adjacent and hypotenuse, coming back over to SOHCAHTOA, the only one that has adjacent and hypotenuse is cosine. We come back, we go, okay, cosine of the angle equals, and then we put the adjacent on the top, hypotenuse on the bottom, and that means we're going to rewrite it in the calculator, where we're going to put the number from the fraction first, the variables on top, which means you're going to put multiply, and then the cosine of 28 goes at the end. And we get 8.8. So y is 8.8. So once you get enough practice, you want to write this line down, but then the line that I had over here, you can start going directly into the calculator. Some of you don't have the same calculator that I do, and so you're going to have to mess with your calculator and learn how to get the same answers that I'm getting, because some of the calculators will make you put the cosine of 28 first and then multiply it with the 10, instead of being able to do 10 times the cosine of 28. It's kind of weird. 17 Same process, so we're gonna ignore y for a little bit. That's adjacent. We'll put ADJ. 12 is your hypotenuse. Adjacent and hypotenuse is cosine, because the so ka toa. You're gonna go cosine. The angle goes here. And then on the other side, there's gonna be a fraction with the adjacent on top and the hypotenuse on the bottom. So it's gonna be 12 times the cosine of 58. And then you get 6.4 for the x. Then you do y by ignoring x, pretend it's not there. That's going to be your opposite. And if you're looking at that and you have opposite and hypotenuse, for SOHCAHTOA, opposite and hypotenuse was sine. So you're going to go sine, the angle, that's an ugly 8, equals, and then it's supposed to be opposite over hypotenuse, so it's y over 12. This means you're going to multiply because y is on the top. So on the calculator, you're going to go 12 times the sine of 58. And you get 10.2. So y is 10.2. Next one. You're going to go, pretend y is not there. That's your opposite. 22 is your hypotenuse. Opposite and hypotenuse was sine. Angle goes next to it. On the fraction, the opposite goes to the top, the hypotenuse goes to the bottom. Because the x is on top, you're going to multiply when you put it in your calculator. So I'm going to put 22 times the sine of 35, and I get 12.6. Then I do y by pretending x wasn't there. This one's your adjacent and your hypotenuse. Adjacent and hypotenuse was cosine. Angle goes next to it. On the fraction, the adjacent on top, the hypotenuse on the bottom. So you're going to put in the calculator 22, because y is on top, multiply, and then cosine 35. And you get 18.0 for the y. Number 19, continuing on. So from here, if we pretend y is not there, x is your opposite, 15 is your hypotenuse. Opposite and hypotenuse was sine. Then you put the 33, your angle. On the other side, your fraction has the opposite on top, your hypotenuse on the bottom. X is on top, so you're going to multiply it. So you're going to go 15 times the sine of 33. And you get 8.2 for x. And then you cover up the x, pretend it's not there. That's your adjacent and your hypotenuse. Adjacent and hypotenuse is cosine. So I'm going to put cos. Then the angle, 33, equals, and then my fraction is going to have the adjacent on the top and the hypotenuse on the bottom. Y is on top, so I multiply it. It's going to be 15 times the cosine of 33. And I get 12.6 for the y. Number 20, that's opposite, that's hypotenuse, that's sine. Angle goes next to it, opposite on top, hypotenuse on the bottom. We're following the same pattern. So it's going to be 9 times the sine of 20, and you get 3.1 for the x. For the y value, that's adjacent. 9 is hypotenuse. Adjacent and hypotenuse is cosine. Adjacent on top, hypotenuse on the bottom. So it's going to be 9 times the cosine of 20. And you get 8.5. (21) From here, careful, x is adjacent, 25 is hypotenuse. Adjacent and hypotenuse means that this time for the x, we're going to do cosine first. Adjacent on top, hypotenuse on the bottom. The rest of the process is the same. X is on top, so you're still going to multiply it. So in the calculator, it's going to be 25 times the cosine of 51. And you get 15.7 for the x. Then when you do y, you're going to go, that's opposite and hypotenuse. That one's the sine. Opposite goes on top, hypotenuse goes down to the bottom. This means you're multiplying because the variable's on top. So it's 25 times the sine of 51. You get 19.4. And then for the last two problems, it says use the trig ratio to write an equation to find x. So if you look, we have an angle way over here, which means that x is your opposite, and 16 is across from the right angle. That means it's your hypotenuse. And the one that has opposite and hypotenuse was sine. The angle always goes next to sine, cosine, or tangent. And then your fraction goes, according to sine, opposite on top, hypotenuse on the bottom. And then for 23, it says to solve that equation. So in the calculator, you're going to start with the number that came from the fraction, which is the 16. Because the variable is on top, you multiply, and then you put the sine 12, and you get 3.3. So that means x would be 3.3 feet. That would be the height of this ramp.